are going to do a fun little video here. The comparison between a Gibson Les Paul and an Epiphone Les Paul. And these are both almost brand new. I guess I've had this one a little less than a year, the Gibson. And we have the Epiphone Les Paul that just came in last week. So we're going to do a little side-by-side comparison of these things. Before we get into that, I want to thank my Patreon supporters. Patreon supporter actually, made both of these possible, but this guitar right here actually belongs to a Patreon supporter. I'll tell you at the end of the video what our plans for this guitar are. So thank you to everybody who supports us on Patreon, as well as YouTube members, everybody who's a super chats and super thanks in the videos. I appreciate you all. And then, of course, if you go down below and use some of those links, various products and whatnot that we talk about, that helps out the channel, as well as Dylan Talks Tone, because we're going to put pickups in this guitar, and they're going to be pickups that you can buy on a limited run. So we'll get into that probably next week. But before we do that, I want to do a side-by-side comparison of these two guitars. Let's set a couple of kind of, I don't want to say ground rules, but let's just call it, let's talk about a basis first of all. First of all, the sounds that you just heard are both of the guitars through the Tonex Super Reverb with the Moxie Overdrive. And the reason I did that is because I just knew everybody was going to be like, you got to compare the A/B test and whatever. They're not going to sound the same. The reason they're not going to sound the same predominantly is because the pickups are completely different. This is a Slash Les Paul, and it's got the Alnico 2 little higher output pickups. This one does not. We will get into the math of all of that later. This is going to be a bit of a long video because we're going to go side by side, component by component through these two guitars. One of the things we want to talk about though is this is not, is the guitar worth it or not? Only you can prevent forest fires, and only you can decide what you are willing to spend for a particular guitar. So this is not about which one is worth it and, this guitar is as good as that guitar. I will tell you right now, having them both in my hands, that the Gibson is a better guitar in that it is better constructed. It has better components. The wood is better. Everything about this guitar is actually better, and that is why it costs more. Whether you perceive that as being better is up to you, because that has to do with how much money you're willing to spend for a guitar, etc., etc. But when we start to talk about the actual components side by side, there are some very major differences that not only make the guitar more desirable, the Gibson, for some folks who like this kind of stuff, but also there is a reason why this thing costs a lot more, and we're going to get into that as well. So it's not which one's better, it's how are they different. So the first thing we want to talk about is some general differences between the two guitars, and that has to do with where they come from. For those of you that are not aware, the Gibson Les Paul is made in Tennessee in the United States, and it is handcrafted there. Of course, they use CNC machines and stuff because that's what we do in 2023. But one of the things I want to talk about is a lot of people say that the wood is the same. It is not. So I spoke with actually the guy that sold Gibson their bodies for last month. And he told me that the mahogany for a Gibson Les Paul comes from, it could come from a couple places. South America, there's a couple places in Central and South America, Guatemala. There is also a major source that has recently become available in Fiji, believe it or not. There's a whole story with that, but it's very interesting. But anyway, and it's real mahogany, okay? There are a lot of woods that are not mahogany that say they're mahogany. We'll get into that in a minute. But those pieces of wood are sourced specifically for Gibson, for Gibson Les Paul bodies, Gibson SG bodies, and very specifically picked for those particular models of guitars from a couple of different countries. They're going away from South America more because the the culture down there, they're running out of wood, number one. And number two, some of the conservation efforts down there are making it to where it's getting more and more difficult to get wood out of South America. But this mahogany stand in Fiji is pretty killer. So they're getting some wood from there, but it's real mahogany, okay? And there is a difference. So we want to talk about that. And we'll get into the difference in construction of the guitar when we get them apart, but we'll do that in a few minutes. Let's talk about the Epiphone. The Epiphone is also mahogany according to the website. However, on the website, there is a disclaimer on the Epiphone website that does not occur on the Gibson website. In order to continually improve the design, quality, and performance of our products and instruments, and to make use of the best materials at all times, Epiphone reserves the right to change specifications without notice. This disclaimer does not exist on the Gibson Les Paul listing on their website because they know where their wood comes from for the Gibson stuff. When a foreign-made guitar, this guitar is made in China, when it is built, the manufacturer, Fender does this, Gibson does this, PRS does this too. Basically, when they say, we want this guitar to cost $699 and we want it to look like this and we want it to do this and this and this, they don't really have a whole lot of choice in what it's made of. So basically, they can say, we're going to use, like this is mahogany, but in China, there are lots of locally available mahogany-ish woods, okay? 250 species, I think, that would fall sort of in the mahogany-ish category. NATO is one. Now, I'm not saying this is NATO, but I'm saying that is an example. And NATO actually just means wood in one of their dialects because they know it's just a generic term. What I'm getting at is Epiphone, this guitar could be made out of basically anything that resembles mahogany, and then they would just call it mahogany on the website. In fact, there are certain countries, according to my wood guy, that if you look at the bill of lading and the customs documents, it will tell you specifically the species of wood, because I believe in Europe it's required that they have to have this specific species of wood, but for marketing purposes, they just call it mahogany generically to not confuse consumers. But because we're doing a video that's doing a deep dive, I'm telling you, this is a mahogany, but we don't exactly know what it is. We don't know what grade it is, and the wood that they use in these guitars oftentimes would never fly in a Gibson based on defects, and this particular one's very pretty, but based on the actual species of wood that it is, would never fly in a Gibson. They also don't really have that much choice. So that's why they put the thing on the website saying, well, we could use parts from here, we could use wood from here, it could be this, it could be that, but you don't really know, but we're all going to call it mahogany because that's kind of what it looks like and what it is. And according to the broader sense of the generic term, it's mahogany. So it's not the same wood. People have argued about this in forums forever. It's not the same wood. It does not come from the same place. The Chinese guitars are typically sourced from locally available mahogany sources to the Chinese factories. This also does happen in Indonesia, Jakarta, some other places as well. All right, let's get into this. This is pretty crazy. So first, let's talk about hardware. Because hardware, people think it's just the same. It is not. So first of all, let's talk about the bridge. We have an Epiphone branded bridge, which is very clearly like a Chinese pot metal, basically. You can see the casting marks in it and stuff. That's what that thing is. And then this is a Gibson ABR1 bridge. I believe these are chromed in Nashville, and I believe that is true because when you look at the tailpieces, the tailpiece for the Epiphone says Epiphone. It's stamped on the bottom. Same thing. Comes from the same factory in China that the Fender ones did. Remember on that other guitar? Anyway, long story short, this says Epiphone on it. It does have the little Epiphone spring steel things to keep it clamped on the screws. The Gibson one says advanced plating on the bottom, which I know is in Nashville. My buddy Steve runs that deal. This is aluminum. The Epiphone one is some kind of pot metal. It weighs about 3 times as much as the Gibson one, which is kind of interesting. So yeah, definite difference in quality of hardware for sure. The other thing I noticed as I was working on this stuff, the quality of the plastics. So this is the back cover and the switch cover. The casting on the plastics, or the injection molding, or however they're made, is much different than the ones on the Gibson. The quality of how the screws fit into the chamfers for the holes, that sort of thing. And then when you look at the pickup surrounds and the plastics for the pickup surrounds, in fact, the neck pickup surround is a different thickness on the Epiphone one. It's actually thicker. The Gibson one is thinner. And it's just the porosity and the overall injection molding process on this stuff is different. You can definitely tell there's a difference in quality between the two guitars. The pickups. So since I have this in my hand, one more thing before we get to that too, is the quality of the screws. So these are definitely like the kind of the Chinese screws. When you put the screwdriver into the screw, how sometimes you can tell how sure it fits, and it's super nice, and you're not going to strip it. That's not the case with these Epiphone screws. When you look at them next to the Gibson screws, like for example the pickup surround screws, which is what I'm showing you here, just completely different fit. And the Epiphone uses like a generic screw size for most things on the guitar. So it's like all one screw size, where on the Gibson side they use specific screw sizes for each thing. So the back plate, the switch cover plate, the output jack tip, the output jack surround, the pickup screws, all that stuff all has its own sizes and own quality of stuff. If you look at the jack plate on both guitars, first of all, you can see the quality of the plastics is different. The other thing is that the Epiphone one has the Chinese stamped Epiphone switch or output jack in it. The Gibson one has a switchcraft, so there is definitely a difference there as well. Other bits of hardware, let's talk about frets. So the frets are actually the same width on both guitars, but the Epiphone is about 8/1000th taller than the Gibson. So the Epiphone frets are actually taller, which is interesting, and we'll get into the dimensions of the guitar in a couple of minutes when we talk about body construction and that sort of stuff. Moving on to electronics. Let's flip this baby over. We have a switchcraft switch in the Gibson. We have the Epiphone Shorty in this. So when we talk about construction of the guitars, you use short shaft pots in an Epiphone, which is like the normal 3/8 depth, I think, pots that go into, you could use them in a Strat or you could use them in an Epiphone. In a Gibson Les Paul, you have to use the long shaft ones because of the construction and how the thing is grounded and everything, and we'll show you that in a minute. Once we get the back cover off of the Epiphone, we can see that we have CTS 500K pots. What is this cap? I forgot to check. Oh, it's 22. This 22 cap is interesting because it looks like a generic Mallory. It's not a Mallory. It's some probably Chinese version of a Mallory. It's some cap in there like that. We have plastic connectors, which I don't see any problem with, honestly. The only issue there would be compatibility. But these are not on circuit boards or anything. They're basically just soldered to little pigtails, so you could just pull those pigtails out and replace them when you do that. But the CTS 500K pots and the caps, those are pretty decent, really. But you've got some plastic connectors in there that you can tell. And then the pickups are 2-wire with plastic connectors on the end, and they are 8.7K right in there, and I think they're an Alnico 5 magnet. So there you go, and these are designed by Epiphone, Chinese pickups. Again, this is another thing where they just source them from an outside company. They stamp their name on the bottom, and they're just the same cheap pickups that are in every other guitar, as long as they have the general specs that Epiphone is looking for. It's just kind of the way these Asian guitars, the parts are sourced and made. So when we look at the wiring on the Gibson Les Paul, you'll see that instead of having ground wires to go around to the knobs, it actually had the pots. It actually has this plate that the pots go through. And so you've got those longer shaft plates, you've got these orange drop caps, and you've got Gibson branded, I believe they're Gibson branded CTS pots. I think they're CTS, if I recall, because I used to be able to buy them. They are 500K. They're in this guitar. They're 500K. They're not 330. I did check that. They're 500K in this guitar also. Yeah, pretty quality stuff, really. But yeah, very interesting. Definitely differences in the electronics for sure. Let's see. So we've got all that. So now let's talk about body construction. Kind of get back to woods. You can see this is a multi-piece back. It's not straight, a little crooked, but you know, that's okay. I don't think there's really anything hurting that. When we flip it over and we look inside the bodies of both guitars, we can see the construction is different. The neck tenon is different on both guitars. This guitar also, the Epiphone, has, it does have a maple cap on it, but it's probably ugly, so they put a veneer on top. That is a way to definitely save costs over the Gibson. When you look at the difference between some generic mahogany, you look at the cost of a body blank for, you know, like the mahogany body blank for a Gibson, and you figure, let's say Gibson pays $60 or $80 for it, and then you look at the cost of one of these body blanks probably being in the $20 range. You can definitely see a cost difference there when you put those multipliers in when you build a business. So when you think about how stuff works, if something costs $1 on a guitar, it typically ends up being about $4 or so to the end consumer. So when you take the multipliers of each of these little cost differences, even the cost of the screws, and you add them up, now you can start to see, outside of labor, not even talking about labor, but parts of cost of parts, we're talking about a big difference here. I would mention too that the fret hardness is different. Used in all, and I don't have like a Rockwell tester or anything, but being a knife nerd, checking the hardness of metals is something that I do, and I will tell you that the frets that are in that Gibson are way better than the frets that are in the Epiphone quality-wise, which is something that we've seen a lot on most electric guitars from Asia versus the higher quality stuff that we see from Japan, or even the higher quality stuff that we see from Japan, or even Indonesia, or even in the United States. So kind of an interesting thing there. Just different, you know, just different because trying to build to a price. This guitar I think is $699 new, and so they have to build down to that price, and they're making decisions to build down to that price. A couple other construction things that are interesting. First of all, we have a urethane finish on this guitar versus a lacquer finish on that guitar, which leads to a couple of different ways that things are done on the guitar. So on the Les Paul, on the Gibson Les Paul, the guitar has a binding that has basically been scraped, and then once it's buffed, it looks pretty nice. This guitar has been urethane, and it's just a tape line. They just pull the tape off afterwards. So that's why on a Gibson Les Paul, some people don't like the imperfection of feeling the edge of the binding and knowing that that's an actual piece that's laid in there, and someone to call that a quality control problem, like you can feel the edge of it. But that's why, because it's actually a notch that has been routed out on the body, the binding has been fit around everything, then the guitar has been painted, and then somebody comes with a razor blade and scrapes the paint back off, and then they clear over it. So you can, and this finish is thinner, so you can still feel and see that edge, which is because it's a piece that's been put on the guitar. In this situation, the same thing has been done, the routing has been done, but you can very clearly see that it has actually just been sprayed over and then sprayed over again, and the only thing that they've done is, because you can see a tape line. They did not scrape the top of the binding as it appears on the guitar. They actually just painted over the whole thing and then just pulled the tape off the outside. So it's a different feel that way. And some people like that smoother appearance, but I don't. I actually like a bound guitar to feel like it's a bound guitar. So there you go. Speaking of binding, when we move up to the frets, the bound fretboard on an Epiphone is bound first, and then the frets are put in the guitar. On a Gibson, what they actually do is they fret the guitar first, then they bind it, and then they actually grind off the binding afterwards so that the binding has nibs that go over the end of the frets. This again can give you a very handmade feel because they actually have to do this, the finishing anyway, by hand. You can, some custom shops do with a razor blade, and it's a very involved process. This right here, this is a very labor intensive process to do this on a Les Paul versus just binding the neck, putting the frets in, and then being done. The side thing to that is when you measure the nut width, they are generally the same on both guitars, except that the Les Paul, the Gibson Les Paul, is a little bit wider because the binding is, I don't want to say not taken into consideration with the nut width, but it is wider by basically the width of the binding. So the effective feel of the guitar is the neck is just a touch wider, and it's got that bound edge on it in a different way than, it feels different than the Epiphone Les Paul. The Epiphone Les Paul is a little bit more round. The way they finish the binding on the neck, it's a little bit more round. This has got a little bit kind of square edge to it, so it feels very different when you play it. It's a small thing, but it feels very different. One of the things that people talk about all the time is the, first of all, the difference in neck angle. So here's both guitars with the necks stacked on top of each other so that you can see for yourself if there or is not a difference in neck angle. I will leave that up to you to discuss in the comments. And then the other thing is, a lot of people talk about the headstock breaking off, blah, blah, blah. But the thickness behind the nut right here is the same on both guitars. So that's mythical when it really comes down to it. They're both the same. Epiphone could break off the same way a Gibson could break off. Just is what it is. Don't drop your guitar and your headstock will stay on. I don't know if you know that or not, but that's kind of how it works. Oh, the other thing that people talk about is, are the horns the same shape? Check this out. They definitely are. If you stack them on top of each other, they are definitely different. So that's kind of a fun thing too. There you go. Maybe there's a detail or two that I missed. I tried to go kind of over everything. If you'll notice, I didn't really reference a spec sheet on this thing. Anybody can just put two spec sheets next to each other and compare them. But there's a lot of little things that add up to a lot between the differences between these two guitars. What does it all mean? Well, nothing really. They're different. The one point I would make between these two guitars is they're not the same. They look the same. They are sort of, obviously, one is a copy of the other by Epiphone, built to a price. That's the number one thing. With a $3,000 guitar versus a $700 guitar, when you look at the multipliers of each part, we're not talking about foreign labor. We're not talking about any of those things. What we're talking about is part. The cost of this screw. If the cost of this screw is 3 cents on this guitar and it is 9 cents on that guitar, then that means it's 3 times as much. And sometimes when those things multiply up, the end result to the consumer can be quite a bit more, as in the case of a Les Paul. But as you can see, some of the things that are done don't necessarily matter. Do you need fret nibs on your neck? Nah. I mean, nobody really needs it. Do you want it? Yeah, I do. I want an actual Les Paul because I want that. I've always wanted one. So it's not necessarily, you can now go and make a decision based on what you see here, whether spending $3,000 for a Les Paul or spending $700 for a Les Paul is something that you want to do. Is having it made in the United States important to you? If not, then don't worry about it. Are all those little details important to you? If not, then don't worry about it. This is a fantastic instrument. It is really, really good. But it is different. It is definitely built down to a price. And so just knowing those things and knowing the differences between the two, now you can go ahead and figure out that value proposition. I personally love my Gibson. I really do. But just understand that these two guitars are made for two different people. And I would proudly own one of these as well for different purposes. They are different guitars for different purposes for different people. And so you just need to decide which person you are. Thanks for hanging out, for doing this with me. This was really fun. It was really an involved thing to do. It took a long time to shoot and it took a long time to put together. I wanted to make sure that we kind of did it unbiased from any computer knowledge. I just wanted to sit here and measure stuff myself and look at stuff myself. I did not weigh both guitars because, like I said, the wood is different, so it doesn't necessarily matter. Or, well, it can't be quantified properly. The tone is different because the pickups are different, you know, that sort of thing. But at the end of the day, they're both great. If you have any questions or any observations that you've noticed about your Gibson or your Epiphone, please put them in the comments. Please be nice. I know a lot of people can get really polarized on this subject, but hey man, we're all friends here doing guitar stuff. So do me a favor and just have a fun chat in the comments. Make sure you hit the like button and the subscribe button because we're going to put a bunch of Graphtec stuff on this guitar. And we are also going to put a new set of pickups in it. And we're going to build it up sort of like a greeny Les Paul, which is going to be kind of fun. So I think you are going to enjoy that as well. So do me a favor, hit the subscribe button and the like button and the bell next to it so you know when we come out with the next video on this guitar. Thanks for hanging out, and we'll see you soon.